Yo, YouTube, what's up with your boy? Sports and Fitness Rants. I'm back, guys. Click that like button. Subscribe to my channel. What's up, y'all? Welcome back, guys. Welcome back, man. Got another great video for you guys today, as usual, man. You guys know the deal on this channel. It's all about setting the record straight, stopping the lies, and stopping the narrative, stopping them from rewriting history, guys. And in this video, we're going to do just that. We're going to stop them from rewriting the history and bending reality about Tim Duncan. And we're going to go over Tim Duncan and I heard Tim Duncan's name brought up recently in this Tim Duncan versus Kevin Garnett type of deal. Like, oh, Kevin Garnett was better than Tim Duncan and blah, blah, blah. And, when people talk about Tim Duncan, when I hear people try to critique Tim Duncan, oftentimes they bring up Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker. Once again, doing what these people do, these fake fans of this era, they love to talk about the teammates of these great players and act as if no one else had any help except for this person or that person. And I always hear people bring up Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker as if they made Tim Duncan great, or as if they were on the Spurs before Tim Duncan. Like, they really want you to believe that Tim Duncan would not do anything without these guys, and they use it as an excuse to excuse Tim Duncan's greatness. And we're going to talk about in this video, man, the dynamic of Tim Duncan and people saying, oh, he had Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker. Once again, always trying to take away from the all-time greats by pointing out their teammates. Makes no sense. No one's allowed to have help. None of these great players can have help, according to these new age fans, right? So we're going to talk about it, guys. And I want to thank you guys, everyone across the world, everyone across the states has been supporting my channel, guys. Once again, I am truly, truly humbled by all the support, guys. It means a lot. Shout out to everybody in the membership, man. Thank you, guys. It's truly humbling, guys. Like I said, if you guys to roll with me and stand up with me, man, and support my channel, thank you, guys. And you guys know what to do. Turn the volume all the way up. Hit that play button. Remember, these videos are for educational purposes. And let's roll. So, yes, guys, like I said, man, I wanted to do a video on Tim Duncan real quick, man. And like I said, talk about some of this nonsense I hear. Once again, they're trying to rewrite Tim Duncan's history and bend reality and make it seem as if, Tim Duncan's teammates were greater than they were. Many times when you have these debates or these discussions and Tim Duncan's name gets brought up, whether it was like the Kevin Garnett discussion I was mentioned earlier, or even a Tim Duncan versus a Kobe Bryant, which you'll often hear brought up as, who was the greater player of the 2000s, right? It often comes down to, Tim Duncan, a Kobe Bryant, maybe even a Shaquille O'Neal. But when people try to argue against Tim Duncan, oftentimes you hear them bring up Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker. Not to give Tony Parker or Manu Ginobili their credit or their just due. They bring these other players up to take away from Tim Duncan's greatness. So they might bring up David Robinson, right? They might bring up a Kawhi Leonard. This is what they do. And it doesn't make any sense, because if we're debating two great players, then we should be debating their resumes, and they should be able to stand on their resumes. We don't make excuses. Oh, this guy played on this team. He played with this guy. He played for this coach. Once again, you're trying to rewrite the history now, and you're making excuses for other players and their failures or their faults of their career. And that's what happens with Tim Duncan, because it's hard to argue against Tim Duncan's greatness, his presence on the court, right? The way that he approached the game. Most people respect Tim Duncan, the way he went about his business. He wasn't all rah-rah and get in your face and all this stuff. He wasn't flashy or fancy, but he got the job done. He showed up to work every single game, and he went out there and played with the love of the game, and he gave the effort on both sides of the ball. Tim Duncan, like I said, one of the great two-way players in the history of the game. And like I said, one of the greatest defensive players in the history of the game. Just an anchor on defense. This was Tim Duncan. This is what he did for the San Antonio Spurs, guys, all of those years. Now, let's think about this. When we think about a Manu Ginobili and a Tony Parker, let's think about these players. I feel like a lot of times people forget that Manu Ginobili was like the second-round pick. I believe he was like I want to say it was like the 28th pick in the second round. Right? So he was like the 50-something pick of the draft, guys. So once again, when they talk about Manu Ginobili, this does not take away from Manu Ginobili's greatness. He was a great player, Manu Ginobili, right? We all know that he made his name out there in Argentina, leading them to a gold medal in the 2004 Olympics. But Manu Ginobili was the 28th pick of the second round, guys. This man was not a number 1 pick or a number 3 pick or a top 5 pick or a top 10 pick. He was a number 28th pick in the second round. So what does that mean? That means there were literally like 40 or 50 different times that a team could have selected Manu Ginobili. He didn't even go in the first round, and he was the 28th pick of the second round. So almost 2 full rounds went by before Manu Ginobili was even drafted in the NBA. Now remember, Manu Ginobili was drafted in 1999, right? His first year would have been the 99-2000 season, but he did not come to the NBA, I believe, until the 02-03 season, I believe. All right? So think about that. You had Ginobili get drafted in 99 draft, but did not come into the league until the 02-03 season. Just coincidentally, the Spurs won that year. So let's be real right there, off the jump. Manu Ginobili was a great player, but he was not a highly talented player coming into the NBA. No one knew who this guy was. When Manu Ginobili got drafted by the Spurs, guys, people were like, who the hell are the Spurs drafting? Who's Manu Ginobili? That's what they were saying his name. They didn't know how to pronounce this dude's name. No one knew who Ginobili was, except for the die-hard FIBA fans, people who knew about Argentina basketball. No one knew who Manu Ginobili was. Tim Duncan didn't know who Manu Ginobili was. Nobody did. And that's the point here. Tim Duncan was so great, and his game was so well-rounded, and was able to fit into any system effortlessly, seamlessly, that guys like Manu Ginobili were able to be great with Tim Duncan. And Tim Duncan made them greater. They were already good players, but they're greater with Tim Duncan. Okay, guys, you get that? And Manu Ginobili could have been taken by many teams, guys, but no one drafted Manu Ginobili. Nobody knew who he was, except for the Spurs, because they did their due diligence. That was the thing about the Spurs in the 2000s. This thing about Tony Parker, for example, same scenario. Once again, a foreign player that nobody knew who he was. Tony Parker was what? The 28th pick of the first round. The 28th pick. So once again, this was not Tony Parker being a top 5 or top 3 or number 1 draft pick with all this hype coming out of France. France. People used to make fun of players from France when I was growing up in the 80s and the 90s. France, they were known or seen as soft. And here goes Tony Parker from France that no one's heard of, come to the San Antonio Spurs the year before Manu Ginobili got there. 2001-2002 season was Tony Parker's first season, guys. Go look at Tony Parker's numbers his first season. He started most of the games. He didn't put up some historic crazy numbers that first season. He wasn't blowing away the competition and blowing away all the people of the NBA. Like, damn, who's this guy? It took Tony Parker a couple of years to even make an all-star team. So once again, when we talk about Tony Parker coming to the Spurs and they try to use that as a knock on Tim Duncan's greatness, once again, I'll say, Tim Duncan allowing someone like a Tony Parker to become greater, to be greater with Tim Duncan. He's already a good player, but he's greater with Tim Duncan. There's not the other way around these guys making Tim Duncan great. It was Tim Duncan as the leader and the anchor of the Spurs. The leader and the anchor on the defensive end. All those years. Even on the offensive end, his down low post presence. That's Tim Duncan. Tim Duncan's the only player, guys, from when he got drafted in the 1998 season, right? The 97 draft, 97-98 season was his first season in the NBA, guys. Tim Duncan's the only player from when he came onto the Spurs in 1998 to when he retired on the Spurs in 2016, might have been his last year. He's the only player to be on all 5 championship teams. Nobody else on all 5 championship teams, guys. Not Manu Ginobili, not Tony Parker, not David Robinson, not Kawhi Leonard. None of these guys were on all 5 championship teams. It was only Tim Duncan. So what does that show you? That Tim Duncan was the mainstay. It was him. He was the guy, the anchor there for all of those teams. He's the only guy to be on all 5 championship teams, guys. The only one. There's no other player in the Spurs organization that was on all 5 teams, if I'm not mistaken, other than Tim Duncan. I know Tony Parker wasn't. I know Manu Ginobili wasn't. I know David Robinson wasn't. I know Sean Elliott wasn't. I know Kawhi Leonard wasn't. I know Steve Kerr wasn't. Steven Jackson, Robert Horry. None of these guys were on all the teams. Tim Duncan was. Let's think about Greg Popovich, guys. He was, I believe he came in like maybe like after like 20 or 30 games in the 1996 1997 season. Greg Popovich, I believe, took over as a head coach. And David Robinson only played 6 games that season. I think he hurt his knee, if I remember correctly. And he missed basically the entire season. And this would allow them to draft Tim Duncan. They only won 20 games that year because David Robinson missed the entire season. And then they were allowed to draft a Tim Duncan with the first pick that year. And the rest is history. But David Robinson was not on all those championship teams. So, yes, Tim Duncan did have an advantage. He did have David Robinson on the team when he got there. So, absolutely, that definitely helped Tim Duncan and his overall development. It helped him, I'm sure, learn from someone like a David Robinson, an all-time great legend, and a big man at that. Right? David Robinson had been on the Spurs all those years. So, yes, that absolutely helped a Tim Duncan coming onto a team with a legend on the team already. And especially a guy like David Robinson, who's a high-class individual, a high-integrity guy, showed up to work. He played and gave the effort. That's a great guy to learn from. And Tim Duncan, once again, he had his own game already when he came in. He was pretty much ready to go because of all the years he had played at Wake Forest. So, once again, Tim Duncan earning his respect and earning the overall game in college at Wake Forest. And then coming in, the dude was already ready to go. Made an all-defensive team. I believe made all-NBA team his first season in the league. This was Tim Duncan, guys. There was no developmental years for Tim Duncan. He was already ready to go. The things he learned from David Robinson, how to be a professional, right? How to be a leader, the leadership roles. These are the things he learned from a David Robinson. How to be a professional. And the tricks and the trades of being a big man in the NBA. Once again, David Robinson's a legendary two-way player on defense and on offense. So now when we think about Tim Duncan and people try to take away from Tim Duncan's greatness by bringing up his teammates, let's understand something, that it was Tim Duncan that was the anchor. It was Tim Duncan that once again allowed these guys to have a role, to be successful in their roles, right? And allowed them to be greater. Tim Duncan's leadership, man, it can't be questioned. Like I said, the man was one of those guys where he didn't have to yell in these guys' faces and be like that. He didn't have to be a Draymond Green type of guy, or even a Michael Jordan where he's in your face and he's, like I said, he's all up in these guys, man, right? And he might say some crazy things and do some crazy things. That was not Tim Duncan. Tim Duncan was the silent leader, right? Leading by example. I told you guys, the greatest leaders all lead by example. Even Michael Jordan, even though they're different dynamics of Tim Duncan and Michael Jordan, what did Michael Jordan say? He never asked his teammates to do anything that he didn't do himself. That's Tim Duncan. Tim Duncan's going out there giving the effort. He's showing up every single night. He ain't load managing like that. Now, we can go back and forth about the Spurs being the first team or the organization to introduce quote-unquote load managing. And I've gone back and forth with guys like Gilbert Arenas about this. Even though the Spurs may be the organization that's known for bringing in load management, we must understand something. The reason why they started doing the quote-unquote load managing in San Antonio is because from about 2000 or 99 essentially to what? Every year to about 2016, the Spurs were making deep playoff runs, especially in the early 2000s. Remember, 99 they won, deep playoff run. 2003, 2005, 2007. And all the years in between that, they're making deep runs. Second round, conference finals, every year. So Greg Popovich decided to rest a starter here and there throughout the season because they were always making deep playoff runs. I respect that. Once again, this is not Tim Duncan missing 20, 30 games a season. He might have missed 5 games, 6 games, 7 games. That's how they were load managing. Tim Duncan was still playing 75 games, 77 games. He wasn't playing 55 games, 60 games, Tim Duncan. Ginobili wasn't playing 50 games, 60 games, or Parker, any of these guys. So the quote-unquote load managing was not being abused or used to the level it is now. It wasn't used for rest per se. These guys are just taking mental health breaks now. They're taking breaks because they got plans after the game. A stubbed toe, a jammed finger, they're out. A sore ankle, they're out with soreness now. That was not the case or the reason why the Spurs started doing the quote-unquote load managing. Okay? So let's get that straight to the jump. Tim Duncan was not load managing. He wasn't walking around on defense out there. He wasn't lollygagging. He was out there giving the hustle, the effort, and being a leader, being a true professional. So I don't know when people talk about Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker, or they talk about Kawhi Leonard down the road as guys that Tim Duncan played with. Absolutely. He's played with some great players. But let's not get it twisted and act like these guys were going to be that great without Tim Duncan. If Tim Duncan's never drafted to the Spurs ain't winning those championships, guys. Let's be real. Okay? That was part of the problem for the Spurs all those years in the 90s. They had David Robinson, Sean Elliott, and really nothing else. They had guys like Vinny Del Negro over the years and the Avery Johnsons. Some of these other guys. They had a Dennis Rodman there for a couple of years. It didn't work out. But they can never get past teams like the Houston Rockets or the Utah Jazz, the Phoenix Suns, the Seattle Sonics. There was a lot of comp in the 90s Western Conference, guys. Top to bottom. Really great teams. The Portland Trailblazers were tough in the early 90s, right? You're talking about the Utah Jazz, the Phoenix Suns in the early mid-90s were really tough. Like I said, the Houston Rockets, we all know in the mid-90s were great. There was a lot of teams. The Denver Nuggets in the mid-90s were stout with guys like Dikembe Mutombo and Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, LaFonso Ellis, some of these guys. Later down the road, Rodney Rogers. These are some really good teams, man. So it was Tim Duncan, guys. He was the leader of the Spurs. He was the anchor of that great defense. Think about it. Every year, the Spurs were a top defense. You think that was because Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili? No. And that's no knock on these guys. Tony Parker is an excellent player. Manu Ginobili, to me, could have been a starter on any team in the 2000s. But he chose and sacrificed, quote-unquote, numbers to play on the Spurs organization to win. And he played his role masterfully. One of the great six men of that era, of all time. And the craftiness of a Manu Ginobili and the clutch play of Manu Ginobili. He was a clutch-time performer. So was Tim Duncan. Tony Parker won a Finals MVP in the 2007 NBA Finals for his play. These are good players. But it's not that you cannot take away from Tim Duncan. There's not a knock on Tim Duncan for him playing with these guys. Because once again, other teams could have drafted these guys and they did not. No one knew about these guys. Remember, they were going to trade Tony Parker, guys. I believe after that first year, they were going to trade him for Jason Kidd. Jason Kidd was on the Nets. I don't know if it was the year that he went to the Nets or the year before, like he was getting ready to go to the Nets. I can't remember which one it was. But they were going to trade Tony Parker. They were talking as rumors. Trade Tony Parker for Jason Kidd. No one knew who Tony Parker was yet. He was unproven. He came into the NBA, I believe, at 19 years old, guys. 19. Jason Kidd at that point was already, I think, like 30-something years old. Tony Parker was a lot younger. He might have already been 30, Jason Kidd, at that time. So they were talking about rumors, but they didn't do it. They kept Tony Parker there. And once again, the rest is history. But it was guys like Tim Duncan being there. It's Tim Duncan as the mainstay, the anchor for those Spurs championships, guys. He allowed those guys to play their roles, and he allowed them to be successful in the roles. Tony Parker didn't have to be great on defense. He knew he had Tim Duncan behind him. Manu Ginobili, same thing. He had Tim Duncan behind him. Some of those years, he had David Robinson and Tim Duncan behind him. Right? Tony Parker came 0-2. Manu Ginobili came 0-3. And David Robinson retired after the 0-3 championship. So they were a good team with good players. But it was Tim Duncan, the mainstay. Think about all the players that rotated around Tim Duncan, guys, over the years. The man won a championship in his second year and a couple years before his last season. It's crazy, guys, when you think about that. 99 and 2014. That's the longevity, the durability, and the greatness of Tim Duncan, guys, on both sides. That's called longevity. On both sides. The man made an all-defensive team at, 38 years old? Some of these guys that talk about longevity couldn't sniff that. That was Tim Duncan, guys. All those years on the defensive team. Both sides of the ball. How many years were the Spurs the number one defense? That goes to Tim Duncan, guys. They try to take away from these all-time great players now by pumping their teammates up. Or making it seem like they had more help than someone else or other players. Yes, Tim Duncan had help. He played with other great players. So did other great players, guys. It was Tim Duncan, though. He was the unquestioned leader of that team, the anchor of the defense, guys. Don't get it twisted. Those other guys I mentioned were greater because Tim Duncan. Think about, listen, all the players they brought in around him over the years. The Steven Jacksons, the Steve Kerrs, Malik Roses, Rasho Nesterovic, Nazir Muhammad, the Parkers, the Ginobilis, the Kawhi Leonard. How about Kawhi Leonard? People talk about Kawhi Leonard on the Spurs. Did anybody remember Kawhi Leonard at San Diego State in college? No one knew who this guy was. Remember, the Indiana Pacers drafted Kawhi Leonard and traded him to the Spurs. Remember that, guys. Those are the facts. The Pacers drafted Kawhi Leonard and traded him. So, once again, how great was Kawhi Leonard coming out of school? Nobody knew who he was. No one thought he was going to win multiple Defensive Player of the Year awards and develop the way he did. No one knew that. The Spurs might have thought that, but no one knew it. It was the potential. But they act like Kawhi Leonard came in the NBA as a lockdown defender. The man didn't even start. He was behind Richard Jefferson his first year. Kawhi Leonard developed over the years in that San Antonio Spurs system, learning from guys like Tim Duncan, the Ginobilis, the Parkers, the Greg Popoviches, going in and being drafted and being into a well-run organization that helped Kawhi Leonard in the years he would develop. He didn't make an all-star team his first year or his second year or his third year. He didn't make an all-defensive team those first couple of years. None of this stuff, guys. They hype these guys up now trying to rewrite history. Years later, what Kawhi Leonard became. He wasn't like that when he first came in. He wasn't like that in 2013 in the finals or 2014 in the finals. He was nobody. He was a nobody. He had earned and won nothing at that point. It was Kawhi Leonard's hard work on his game and the development, which made him a great player. But he wasn't great when he came in. Same thing with Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker. No one knew who these guys were. Ginobili, I believe, was like 25 years old when he played his first season for the Spurs. 25, he came in as a 25-year-old rookie. They were talking about, oh, Duncan had this guy, Duncan had that guy. No, they had Duncan. They played with Duncan. Remember that. He was the greatest player on that team. Ginobili was fortunate to play with Duncan. Parker was fortunate to play with Duncan. Kawhi Leonard was fortunate to come into the Spurs organization and not go to the Pacers. But now they want to talk around or turn it around and flip it. Duncan had these guys. Duncan was the mainstay all those years, guys. It was Tim Duncan. He was the unquestioned leader, the unquestioned best player, their best defensive player, their best offensive player. You guys know the deal, man. I'll catch you guys on the next one.